Picture a geneticist sitting in a lab somewhere in Europe, not at a dig site, not under a blazing sun in southeastern Turkey, just at a desk, looking at a screen. In front of them is a comparison result. A genetic profile pulled from ancient skeletal material recovered near some of the most famous stone structures on Earth. The analysis is done. The numbers are in. And something is wrong. Not wrong in the sense of a technical error. Wrong in the sense that the result sitting on that screen does not match the story everyone had been telling for decades about who built this place. The remains came from the region around Göbekli Tepe and the broader cluster of pre-pottery Neolithic sites in southeastern Turkey, a complex researchers now call Tas Tepeler, meaning stone hills. These are among the oldest monumental structures ever discovered. The people who carved them, who hauled limestone blocks weighing tons, who organized enormous communal labor without cities, without writing, without pottery, those people left bones behind. And those bones, when finally sequenced, told a story the field was not fully prepared for. The result was published, and then almost nothing happened. That silence is part of what makes this worth examining closely. Because what the DNA appears to show about the builders of Göbekli Tepe doesn't just complicate the local origin story. It raises a question the archaeology alone could never answer. Who exactly were these people? And where did part of them actually come from? To understand why that question matters, you have to understand the site itself. And more importantly, you have to understand how completely it rewrote the rules the moment it was found. Göbekli Tepe sits on a ridge in southeastern Turkey, about 15 kilometers northeast of the city of Şanlıurfa. From a distance, it looks unremarkable, a low hilltop, dry soil, ordinary landscape. But underneath that hill, beginning around 11,600 years ago, someone started building. Not shelters, not storage, something stranger and more deliberate than either. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them reaching 5.5 meters tall and weighing up to 10 tons, arranged in circular enclosures. The surfaces of these pillars are carved, predatory birds, scorpions, snakes, foxes, wild boar, abstract symbols, and occasionally what appear to be stylized human arms. The carvings are not crude, they are not accidental. Someone spent enormous time and care on them. Someone understood composition, understood scale, understood that stone could be made to speak. The archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led excavations at the site from 1994 until his death in 2014, stood in that landscape and said something that became one of the defining statements of modern archaeology. First came the temple, then the city. What he meant was radical. The conventional model of human development had always assumed a sequence. First agriculture, then surplus food, then population density, then complex social organization, then eventually the capacity for large monuments and ritual structures. Göbekli Tepe inverted that model entirely. Here was a monument that predated pottery, that predated domesticated cereals, that predated every city on Earth by thousands of years. And yet it required an organizational capacity and a shared symbolic framework that nobody had predicted hunter-gatherers could possess. The site didn't just push back a date. It forced a complete rethinking of what early humans were capable of, cognitively, socially, spiritually, long before any of the developments we usually associate with civilization. So, who built it? The prevailing model that settled into place over the following decades had an appealing tidiness to it. The builders were understood to be local hunter-gatherers from the Fertile Crescent, specifically from the northern arc where the Zagros and Taurus mountain ranges converge, the zone where wild emmer wheat and wild einkorn still grow today, the very region that would later become the proposed heartland of early agriculture. These were the people already living in southeastern Anatolia. They belonged to the landscape. And later ancient DNA work on Anatolian Neolithic farmers, the populations that followed them, seemed to support this picture by showing deep genetic continuity between the pre-agricultural and early agricultural populations of the region. One coherent local lineage stretching across the transition. One unbroken story of people, place, and eventually civilization. It was a logical model. Geographically, it made sense. Göbekli Tepe sits squarely in the zone where archaeologists had always placed the Neolithic transition. The material culture at the site connected to the broader pre-pottery Neolithic horizon across the region. The artifact record suggested continuity. Nobody had a strong scientific reason to look outside the local frame. The local story was clean, it was tidy, and it fit the evidence that was available at the time. There was just one thing nobody had actually checked. Not really, not directly, not from the construction period individuals themselves. Here is the gap that made the old story so easy to maintain. For a very long time, the genetics of the people who actually built Göbekli Tepe were either unavailable, underanalyzed, or simply absent from the major comparative studies. When geneticists were building out the picture of Anatolian population history, they were largely working with individuals from later periods. Early farmers, people from after the agricultural transition, had already taken hold. The inference backward to the monument builders was archaeological, not genomic. It was reasonable inference, but it was inference. And the reason the gap persisted is not complicated. Ancient DNA is not easy. It is not a matter of swabbing a surface and running a quick test. Genetic material degrades. Soil chemistry attacks it. Time destroys it. And southeastern Turkey, hot, arid, exposed to centuries of variable conditions, is one of the more difficult environments for DNA preservation on Earth. Researchers had known the skeletal material from the Taz Tepeler sites existed, but retrieving usable genomic data from pre-agricultural individuals in that zone, from that period, was genuinely hard. So, the question stayed open, and the inference stayed in place, and the old story kept running on borrowed credibility. The technical breakthrough, when it began to arrive, came from a combination of improved ancient DNA extraction methods and a specific anatomical focus. The key structure is the petrois bone, the dense pyramid-shaped section of the temporal bone that sits behind the ear. It is the hardest bone in the human body, and it sometimes preserves DNA even when everything else in the skeleton has been destroyed. Targeting petrois samples, applying contamination filters, running comparisons against an increasingly rich database of ancient genomes from across Western Eurasia, this is the methodological foundation that allowed researchers to finally begin asking direct questions about the builders, rather than inferring the answer from populations that came after them. The work is painstaking. The modeling required to pull a true ancestry signal out of degraded ancient material, separating real ancestry from noise, from contamination, from the statistical artifacts of small sample size, is not the kind of thing that gets resolved in a single study. It requires multiple independent lines of evidence, cross-referencing across sites, careful calibration against what is already known from the broader ancient DNA record. This is not a lab running a casual test. The difficulty is real, and the data, when it comes, is hard-won. So, when researchers working with material from the Taz Tepe complex, including sites like Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Kayonu, and Bonkuklu Tarla, began generating and analyzing ancient genomes from pre-pottery Neolithic individuals in the region, the question being asked was a clean one. Where do these people fall, genetically, relative to the known ancient populations of Western Eurasia? Do they sit cleanly within the Anatolian hunter-gatherer lineage that the model assumed? Or do they show something more complicated? That's when the genome did something the old model couldn't explain. The individuals associated with the Taz Tepeler complex, the people from the same broad cultural and temporal horizon as the builders of these extraordinary sites, do not reduce to a single clean local ancestry. The picture that emerges from the ancient DNA is more complex. Alongside the Anatolian hunter-gatherer signal, there is a detectable component that points east, toward the Zagros mountain corridor, toward a population that researchers associate with what ancient DNA specialists call Caucasus hunter-gatherers, or CHG, a lineage that is distinct from the Western Anatolian hunter-gatherer ancestry that had been assumed to dominate the region. In plain language, the people who built the world's oldest known monumental structures were not simply the local population everyone assumed them to be. They carried ancestry from a different source, a population with roots further east, in or near the Zagros highlands, a group that was, until recently, almost invisible in the standard narrative of who inhabited the Western Fertile Crescent before agriculture. That is the finding. And it is important to be clear about what makes it credible, because a single anomalous result would be easy to dismiss. The Eastern signal is not appearing in one individual. It shows up across multiple ancient genomes from the region, in a pattern consistent enough to suggest it reflects real population history rather than statistical noise. This is not a single outlier, and it fits, importantly, with what ancient DNA studies from other parts of this broad zone have been showing over the last several years, that the Neolithic transition in Anatolia was not a simple in-place development. It involved population movement, admixture, and contact between groups that older archaeological models had not fully predicted. The CHG-related ancestry that appears in these individuals is a lineage that, elsewhere in the ancient DNA record, contributed heavily to Iranian Neolithic farmers and shows up strongly in populations from the Caucasus. Its presence in the Tas Tepeler individuals implies something significant: contact, and probably movement, across a corridor connecting the Zagros highlands to southeastern Anatolia before agriculture was established, before cities, before any of the developments we usually treat as the preconditions for long-distance connection. This is the first thing the finding rules out clearly. It rules out the tidy model of a single, unbroken local lineage developing in isolation, a population that had been sitting in southeastern Anatolia since the last glacial maximum, gradually accumulating the cognitive and cultural capacity to eventually build Göbekli Tepe on their own terms. That model, clean as it was, appears to be incomplete. Someone, or some portion of the gene pool, came from somewhere else. And here is where the second implication lands. Because if part of the ancestry of the Tas Tepeler builders originated in the Zagros corridor, then the cultural explosion represented by these sites, the organizational complexity, the shared symbolism, the monumentality, may not have been a purely local invention. It may have emerged from a population confluence, two or more lineages meeting in a convergence zone, producing something neither would have produced alone. That is a different story from the one the textbooks have been telling. The third escalation is the hardest to sit with, because this doesn't just affect Göbekli Tepe. The pattern being described, multi-source ancestry, population mixing in the pre-pottery Neolithic, an eastern component flowing into the Western Fertile Crescent before agriculture, is not unique to a single site or a single study. Similar complexity is emerging from other early Neolithic sites across the region. The Fertile Crescent, long imagined as a coherent zone of local development, increasingly looks like it was a meeting place, a convergence point, not a single origin, but an intersection of populations moving through a landscape that connected mountains, river valleys, and plains across hundreds of kilometers. And that's where the story gets harder to ignore. Because the Zagros corridor, or running roughly from what is now northwestern Iran, up through the highlands toward the Caucasus, appears in the ancient DNA record not as an isolated backwater, but as a migration highway. Populations moved through it, genes moved through it, and if genes moved through it, ideas moved through it too, though DNA alone cannot tell us what those ideas were or how they traveled. The broader Tas Tepeler complex reinforces this picture. Karahan Tepe, excavated more recently, and already yielding remarkable carved human figures and architectural forms as sophisticated as anything at Göbekli Tepe, sits within the same regional cluster. Kayonu, further north, provides additional ancient DNA from the same broad temporal frame. Bankuklu Tarla, in southeastern Turkey, adds another data point. The more sites that are sampled, the more the simple local origin story struggles to accommodate the genetic complexity that keeps appearing. Now, this is the moment where the honest version of this story has to slow down slightly, because the evidence here is real and the implications are significant, but it would be wrong to overstate what is actually settled versus what is still being worked out. The sample sizes for pre-agricultural ancient DNA from this zone are still small, genuinely small. Getting usable genomes from pre-pottery Neolithic individuals in southeastern Turkey is difficult, and the database is growing, but it is not yet large enough to make sweeping population-level claims with the kind of a statistical confidence that geneticists prefer. Not all researchers who have looked at this data interpret the Eastern admixture signal the same way. The degree of the contribution, its precise timing, and exactly which source population it reflects are still being debated. This finding does not disprove the importance of local Anatolian ancestry to the Taş Tepeler builders. It complicates the story. What appears to be established is that these individuals are not genetically uniform, and that an Eastern component is present and real. What remains contested is how much of the population it represents, how early the admixture occurred, and what exactly it means for the cultural development of the site. I want to be clear about that distinction. The revelation here is not that the local population played no role. It is that the local population was not the only story, and that a piece of the ancestry, a piece of the human community that built these pillars, came from a direction the standard model had not accounted for. And the question the DNA cannot answer, the one that the bones, for all their testimony, leave completely open, is the question of behavior. Why did people cross that landscape? What drew the Eastern groups westward? Or what pulled Western groups into contact with the East? Was it migration, marriage exchange, a shared ritual network that brought people across hundreds of kilometers to participate in something larger than any single group's territory? The pillars cannot tell us. The carvings cannot tell us. The bones can give us ancestry, but ancestry is not motivation. The movement happened. The mixing happened. The reason people crossed that ground, the nature of the contact, the story of how two genetically distinct populations ended up contributing to the same monumental construction project at the edge of the Neolithic world, that story has not been recovered. It may never be. Return to the site itself for a moment. Göbekli Tepe is still there. The carved pillars are still standing in their enclosures. The foxes and vultures and serpents still look out from stone that has been exposed to 11,000 years of weather. They outlasted the people who made them. They outlasted the civilization, if that word even applies, that gave rise to them. They will almost certainly outlast the current debate about who those people were. But here is what the DNA adds to that image, and why it matters. The people who built this place, who organized the labor, who understood the symbolic language carved into every surface, who apparently gathered here from across a wide region in a period before any of the social structures we associate with organized religion or complex society. Those people carried a mixture of ancestries that the world did not know about until recently. Part of them came from somewhere else. Part of them was Eastern, Highland, Zagros, a lineage that archaeology had not predicted, and that the ancient DNA record is only now beginning to map. And that lineage did not survive cleanly into what came next. The CHG-related ancestry present in the Taş Tepeler individuals does not appear in strong form in the later Anatolian Neolithic farmers, who archaeologists and geneticists have studied more thoroughly. Something happened between the builders and the farmers that came after them. Population replacement, dilution, absorption into a different demographic wave. The details are unclear, but the lineage that contributed to the construction of the world's oldest temple appears to have faded. It was overwritten. The people themselves disappeared into the noise of a later population history. A group that organized the labor for these extraordinary structures, that developed a shared symbolic system sophisticated enough to carve it into 10-ton limestone pillars, that in some sense stood at the threshold of everything we call civilization, left almost no clear trace of their Eastern ancestry in the populations that followed them. The silence after the publication is part of this story too. The data exists. The ancient genomes have been sequenced and compared. The Eastern signal is there, in the record, waiting for the broader conversation to catch up. And the history books, the popular ones, the documentary scripts, the school curricula about the cradle of civilization, have not yet absorbed what that signal implies. Something was built here by people we are only beginning to see, and most of what they were has already been lost.